In breaking news, President Obama announced a shift in Cuban relations by restoring diplomatic missions and releasing of prisoners held by both sides. Let's have a look.
Separately, in exchange for the 3 Cuban agents, Cuba today released one of the most important intelligence agents that the United States has ever had in Cuba, and who has been imprisoned for nearly 2 decades. This man, whose sacrifice has been known to only a few, provided America with the information that allowed us to arrest the network of Cuban agents that included the men transferred to Cuba today, as well as other spies in the United States. This man is now safely on our shores.
A large segment of the press conference was dedicated to the rationale behind the prisoner swap, a long-held symbolic contention between the two countries. The release of the U.S. contractor Alan Gross, held by the Cuban government since 2009, in exchange for the 3 remaining members of the Cuban 5 that had been in prison in the U.S. Now joining us to talk about all of this is Michael Ratner. Michael has been following Cuba and the case of the Cuban 5 for almost his entire life. Michael Ratner is President Emeritus of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York and Chair of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights in Berlin. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
I'm glad to be with you, Sharmini, and of course the real news as well.
Michael, your take on the significance of President Obama's announcement and President Raul Castro's simultaneous response.
I was thrilled with parts of what's going on right now. The first thing I got was a Twitter feed saying the Cuban 3 are going to be freed. And of course, that was very exciting to me. They were part of a group called the Cuban 5. They were Cubans who had been sent into the United States, really, to be able to try and stop activities that were being done by the right-wing Cuban community against Cuba, from bombings to everything else. They were trying to give intelligence to the Cubans about that. They got caught, and rather than what would happen normally, being sent back to Cuba, et cetera, exchange, they got convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage, although they didn't do anything like that, conspiracy to commit murder as well, because they were trying to stop flights from a group called Brothers to the Rescue, a right-wing Cuban group from Miami, invading Cuban airspace, et cetera. They were serving a very long time. 3 remained in jail, one of them for life, and good friends of mine, as well as my office, have been working on that case for years. Lenny Weinglass, who died recently, but while working on that case, Marty Garbus and others. And when I saw that news that they had been freed, I thought, oh my gosh, what a great and important victory for those 3 people and for the Cuban people. You saw at the same time, a man named Alan Gross was let out of a Cuban prison after serving 5 years. He'd been an American convicted for 15 years for basically working for AID, the Agency for International Development, and trying to subvert really the Cuban government by handing out and giving out communication systems so that people could communicate really in terms of fomenting really dissent, not dissent, but the overthrow perhaps eventually of the Cuban government, or certainly giving them lots of trouble. There was no doubt he was a spy. At first, they claimed he wasn't. The Cuban and the American governments claimed it wasn't an exchange. In fact, of course, it obviously was. But that just set up, or was part of what a broader picture of really the beginning of the breaking down of the blockade, the embargo, and the isolation of Cuba. And that's very important. Since I've been a kid, there's been a blockade and embargo and no diplomatic relations with Cuba. That's from 1960 on. The severe blockade of no financial transactions, et cetera, from 1962. My office and others have spent years, from the Venceremos Brigade to going to Cuba, to representing travelers to try and break that blockade. And it looks like we're seeing at the beginning of that. The first thing that's going to happen is there are going to be diplomatic relationships established. Right now, they've been going through the Swiss embassy. That means there'll be an ambassador to Cuba, an ambassador to the United States, a very, very big step. Obama, in his talk, said he was going to lift some of the more severe financial controls, which have to do with remittances to the Cubans, broader categories for travel, things like that. Part of them, of course, from the U.S. point of view, are ways of undermining the Cuban progressive socialist communist system, trying to give independent money to people to do that. Part of them, of course, are needed are needed money because the blockade has really, without question, really damaged the economy of Cuba. So Obama did say this is a failed policy. It hasn't worked. And for us, the United States, us being him referring to the United States, and for us to be the U.S. be able to work with the rest of Latin America, we can't keep isolating Cuba. So after 64 years, the United States finally begins to bend a bit. Raul Castro's speech was quite interesting itself. It did talk about the diplomatic relations being eased and happening. It went after Obama again in the United States for continuing the blockade. Now, the blockade has some issues because the most severe part of the blockade was passed by our Congress, and the president doesn't have the authority alone to overrule that. It's called the Helms-Burton Law, lots of other laws involved. But as Raul Castro said, president of Cuba, there is a lot more Obama could do, even within that framework. And so he's pushing Obama really to modify and end that blockade in a more full way, which Obama does have the ability to do. I think that's a strong point and should not be lost on people. This is only a very small step toward ending the economic isolation of Cuba, which has really hurt the people and citizens of Cuba. The third thing Raul said, which is very important, is our revolution continues. It's continued for this period of time. And this change in U.S. policy will not make us step back from the revolution. So you can't read Obama's speech without also having to read or listen to what Raul said. But look, for all of us, the freeing of the Cuban Five, which a lot of us have worked on for years, and not just the humane situation of the Five, but what it represents and the Cuban efforts to stop the terrorism that has been going on against that island for years, the thousands killed from the Bay of Pigs on, that we hope is now coming to an end, and the people who were trying to stop that are being released. That's important. Diplomatic relations are important. And the fact that I think part of this, and I'm sure, Sharmini, that the people at the Real News, et cetera, are very aware of this, because I know your work in Latin America and others, Latin America is no longer the place it was at the time of the Cuban Revolution or after. It doesn't have the military governments it had, the repressive states. In fact, it has a number of progressive governments in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Brazil, arguably in Argentina, in Uruguay. And so Latin America is no longer really just a play toy or the backyard of the United States. And perhaps looking at not just the Cuban resistance to what the U.S. did in its survival, but looking at the changes in Latin America, and the U.S. can't any longer really function in this part of the hemisphere, in this hemisphere, as if it simply owns the whole sea, because we've had significant changes. And the changes in Cuba and the U.S. changes have to be seen in that light, that they've been forced on the United States.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
And thank you for having me, Sharmini, and my best to my friends on this historic day at the Real News.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.